Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program John Martin, Vice President at MercuryGate, and Brian Thompson, who's Chief Commercial Officer at SMC3. And today we're going to talk about closing the gaps in supply chain visibility. Now, not having visibility to your shipments, your orders, your products is an ongoing challenge for companies across all industries. Some companies may have, good visibility to certain aspects of their supply chain, and they may have poor visibility or, blind spots in other aspects, such as transportation. So how do you go about identifying and closing those visibility gaps? How are new capabilities and technologies helping in this effort? And then ultimately, what are some of the benefits? Well, that's the topic of today's conversation, and it's great to have, both John and Brian with us today to kind of share their insights and perspective and advice on this topic. So John, Brian, welcome to the program.
Adrian, thank you. And Brian, it's good to talk to both of you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. It has stirred a lot of thought in my mind. So looking forward to our conversation, and thanks for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian, again for inviting us. And John, I look forward to sharing our thoughts together. It'll be an interesting show.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is a topic, that's evergreen, right? I mean, it's always, companies continue to struggle with visibility, and the challenge seems to only be, getting greater as time goes on. So John, let me start with you. In your role, you get the opportunity to work with a lot of different clients. I mean, in your experience, working with them, I mean, what are the biggest gaps in supply chain visibility, and why do those gaps still exist?
The things that come to mind immediately for me is the growing complexity of transportation. We have more participants in the network than ever before, and now international transportation for our customers seems to be much more of a requirement than it was in the past. It's not okay to merely focus on whatever continent I happen to be in or whatever country. I think that the thoughts that come to mind for me is that all forms of transportation can be complex, and especially freight transportation. If Star Trek were somehow a prophecy for the future and we have transporters in the future, then we can move anything or anybody from any place to another place at any time, but we don't have that luxury now. So for now, things on this planet move with different methods, and in the context of freight, different modes. And every mode has its own advantages and constraints. So for example, air is fast, but it cannot get from any point to any other point, and it tends to be expensive. The number of providers, methods, geographical limits, boundaries, they're practically unlimited. And having visibility requires interaction with all these systems and data points and exchange of data for maximum visibility. Systems must be engineered to interact with best-of-breed components throughout the worldwide transportation network, while providing a means to normalize and homogenize this data so that these inputs are discernible and actionable. And that's what I need, regardless of what sort of system, whether it's transportation or something else. When I'm dealing with lots of complexity and lots of data, I need that from a system. And I think that I'm really thrilled that we're on this this weblog. I apologize, this weblog with SMC and Brian, because it's an example of what we've been doing for a couple of decades with our partner. SMC is leveraging one another's strengths for this purpose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, you touch upon a number of different things there. Obviously today, even some of the companies that might be smaller, mid-sized, that maybe only operated in a single, geographic region in the past, today they're becoming global themselves. So even smaller companies are now having to deal with multiple modes, much longer, supply chains, more trading partners that they have to connect to and get data from. So that's one, reality there. And then I think it's just the urgency of time. And I think a lot of companies today really have, feel pressure that they have to make quote unquote smarter decisions faster in order to, keep up with, customer demands, both on the consumer end as well as the B2B world. So I think you hit the nail on the head on a few points there. Brian, your thoughts on that question in terms of with the companies and the clients you work with, and kind of what are you hearing from them in terms of, the gaps that they have and why these gaps still exist?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So John raised a number of excellent points, and you talk about the disparate number of providers and sources you have to get this data from. You have to take that data and you have to make sense of it. And John certainly alluded to this. One thing that's Originally the only way to get, if you were talking transportation visibility, the primary method was good old fashioned EDI. And nowadays we're adding on new technologies. You've got web services and APIs that are connecting transportation management systems with inventory and warehouse management systems directly to providers. And now it's really easy to get data overload, right? So while technology has expanded so that even the little guys have access to tremendous amounts of data, now they have the same problem that the big guys used to have, which is how do I take that data, siphon through it, turn that data into information? And again, I just need to know the little pieces that are going to help me act at the right time to be able to drive value to my business, right? So, that's probably one of the biggest problems now is the data overload issue that we have. Not to mention, anytime you're connecting multiple providers, multiple systems, multiple companies, because a true end-to-end supply chain visibility company is multi-enterprise. It's not just even within your own enterprise, but anytime you enter people into it, there's going to be a challenge, right? And so you need these collaboration hubs to communicate suppliers with vendors, with the warehouse management, and with the shipper and the carriers. That's a lot of parties involved just to manage a supply chain from end to end, whether the shipper be big or small.
Yeah, no, great point there. I think the information overload and data overload is a great point. I mean, I was at a conference recently. One of the keynote speakers, I think, said it best. That she said, we're at a point in time where companies arguably have the most data that they've ever had in the history of the business world, yet they have the least amount of insights, right? And I think it kind of speaks to that, because I think ultimately you have to convert that data into insights so then you can take some action. And I think you raise another challenge that companies face is, one is integrating and connecting and getting the data, right? The other one is how do you then actually figure out what's the right data, what's the right information out of all of that that's actually going to provide you with, actionable intelligence, right? To actually, do something that's going to result in a happier customer, or is going to result in, a reduction in cost, or, improvement in productivity and so forth. So Brian, just staying with you, I mean, when it comes to, we touched upon a little bit about this already, but when it comes to transportation visibility more specifically, I mean, are the challenges the same across all modes? Does each mode kind of present, kind of its own unique challenges in trying to get that visibility?
Well, some of the challenges are the same across modes. I mean, you still have to track and find out different modes have different bottlenecks or different points of concern. For example, if it's on the ocean, right, you're not going to worry about, I mean, if it's a 14-day sail, you don't worry about it on day 5 or 6, but you do want to know if it gets stuck in the port or not. Truckload shipments move directly from point to point. So there's a lot of technology out there now that can follow them using GPS. And using some relatively simple analytics, you can estimate a time of arrival for that shipment pretty easily. But LTL networks, for example, are much, much more complex. And, my clients are usually dealing with domestic LTL problems. And not every carrier in the LTL space has a different network design. They have different hub and spoke network, or meet and rally points, meet and turn points. And even if each of those DCs, you don't know how long it takes to get through each break. Each break takes a different amount of time. So the analytics just get much, much more complex. But really, when it comes to shipment visibility, you want that information to be real time, accurate, and actionable. And until now, it's primarily been EDI that's been the source of that. But now we have real time or near real time API connectivity and messages that they can pass back and forth. And so that really helps with shipment status. Not all modes, though, are at the same point in their maturity in adopting these API status messaging points. If you're a 3PL and you're connecting to 20 or 30 carriers, integration into carrier APIs can be time consuming, difficult to manage, and painful to maintain. That's where, there are partners out there now, though, that didn't exist 3, 4, 5 years ago that can help with that process to get set up, integrate and manage those integrations to the carriers, and then also standardize the messaging back, because every carrier has their own individual messages and codes that mean different things for the status of the shipment. So you really need to leverage those partners in order to consume this data in near real time.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, even with, whether it's EDI or it's, APIs, I always talked about kind of integration. We live in a Tower of Babel type of environment, right? Where everyone's kind of speaking a different tongue, if you will. So even though you've got these standards and these technologies, every company, every carrier, every shipper, every receiver, they want to receive data in a certain way, or they want specific types of data and all that. And, being able to do those mappings or be able to present the data and information in the context that whoever is receiving it wants to see it in, is part of the challenge there. John, your thoughts when it comes to, transportation visibility, challenges across different modes, anything you want to add there, particularly on the international side?
Yeah, the things that Brian said just had my mind racing. And when you think about, like, a great management system should be able to easily model what you're actually trying to manage. So in the abstract, if we think about, like, I grew up watching the Brady Bunch, and on the Brady Bunch, Mike Brady, he had blueprints, and then he would build a little model of the house, and then you'd build the actual house. It's the same thing with a great transportation system. And for visibility, I need to be able to model what's actually happening in the real world, which on the surface, we think that, well, that shouldn't be so difficult. But when Brian mentioned, like, a hub and spoke network, that really spurred my thinking, because when you think about each country, each country's politics, their geography, their economic policy, all those things shape how you move freight in that business. We have a lot of land area, we have a lot of population, and we have a federal government structure where you can do business in one state just as easily as another state. Those state boundaries are very much dotted lines, so I can do interstate commerce easily. So we have large national carriers, we have hub and spoke networks, and that works well. But if we turn our attention to Europe, in that case, I do have, even though you've got the EU, you still have some impediments to trade across borders. You've got higher fuel taxes. You have other and more population and a denser landmass, so that shapes the sort of equipment and the modes of transportation and how that transportation is priced. And then you take something and then go to somewhere like New Zealand. So that entire country is the size of New Jersey, and the majority of your freight is coming from overseas. So it's a whole lot of ocean combined with trucks, but it's not a lot. You don't need a lot of variety in the nature of the trucks. All those things, and I know it seems like kind of a tangent, but really, I need a system that can replicate my real-world transportation models well, and then I can begin to consider visibility. So if a system fails to recognize the concrete constraints for each shipping lane, then, and even multiple lanes of transportation and multiple legs, that system and that combination systems will result in inefficiencies and a lack of visibility. So I do need a system that can model a large model that reflects what I'm doing in my business, and not break this down into silos.
Right. No, I think that's a great point, because I think, particularly if you're a large corporation that's operating in multiple geographies, using multiple, modes of transportation, so on and so forth. If you really start drilling down, right, you want to be able to, at the rolled up level, you want to be able to compare apples to apples, if you will. But then at the operational level, you have to also respect the fact that, the way transportation is managed and the constraints and the types of data you might need and collect here in the United States is going to be different than, like you said, in New Zealand. It's going to be different than it might be in Japan or China. It might be different in other parts of the world. So, having that flexibility from a TMS standpoint, let's say, to be able to model those constraints, those business rules, and the way transportation is done in those local areas, I think is part of that foundational layer that's required, so that when you ultimately build that visibility, you trust it, and it's a reflection of what's really happening in each of those areas. So Brian, going back to you now, let's talk about, closing those visibility, gaps. I mean, what's the first step? I mean, how do companies get started, here?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that there's no one size fits all solution. Everyone's going to have their own individual needs and areas where, and level of maturity along the path of supply chain visibility. Realize that, first of all, set your goals, understand your business objective, and where do you expect to receive the most value from supply chain visibility. Visibility in and of itself is not the goal. It's to drive value. Maybe it's getting products to market more timely, or hitting ever tighter and tighter delivery windows forced by retailers. Maybe it's ensuring the product is on the shelf at the right time and limiting your inventory and process. Maybe keeping the supply lines open without overly high inventory costs. So the first step is to understand your readiness. What are your goals? And then figure out what your state of readiness is to tackle those goals, right? You're going to have a unique set of data needs, information needs. Luckily, there are many providers out there today, such as MercuryGate and SMC3 and many others out there that have already created solutions for these problems. And there are use cases that are likely very similar to anyone's needs that wants to achieve end-to-end supply chain visibility. So there are lots of resources out there, and lots of places to start.
No, you raised something that I think it's very important, because whether it's visibility, or certainly it's something that I'm seeing a lot around where some of the other, buzz terms out there, whether it's, blockchain or machine learning and AI and everything else. I mean, I think the biggest mistake companies can do is, race to invest in any kind of technology without first identifying the business opportunity or the problem or the challenge that they're looking, to address. It's to say, yeah, we're going to implement a visibility solution, but without saying, well, what exactly are we trying to accomplish here, right? By having greater visibility, I think it's you end up wasting, time and effort and resources because you really don't know what the destination is, or what the goal is. So I think what you said, it makes a lot of sense. And really, part of that is understanding, what are the metrics, right? What are the metrics that you're looking to improve upon? And those metrics can be transportation oriented, they can be customer service oriented, they can be inventory oriented, but really identifying those metrics that you want to, have visibility, have an impact on. And then that dictates then what kind of data you need to collect and what format that should be in, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a great, first step. John, anything to add on that question?
No, I think you guys are spot on. And and I don't think I have a whole lot to add. The only thing that occurs to me in the conversation that you were having so far, it reminds me of one of my favorite illustrations. Vince Lombardi, the great football coach, he would start every season by walking into the locker room and holding up a football and say, "Gentlemen, this is a football." And his playbook, his offensive playbook, were variations around one play, is just do the right thing and do it right. And so if I start with the baseline of, can the system meet my current and future needs for all necessary modes of transportation? Does the system interface well with other systems, and can I easily add future interfaces? And most importantly, does the system accommodate my business process? Ideally, do I have some type of workflow that mirrors my business? That's the foundation. If I get those fundamentals right, then making sure that all the other details, those are super important. But if I get the foundation right, I'm starting in a good place.
Yeah, I think you bring up another great point, which really is a reality of transportation supply chains in general, which is, today's operating realities is not necessarily going to be tomorrow's, right? So, you may have objectives and reasons why you may want visibility today to achieve a certain goal, but we all know that, 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, you may have different trading partners, different carriers that you're working with, different, competitive actions that you need to respond to, and the like. So, being able to, continuously, adapt and have that flexibility to, move in wherever direction the market or customers are taking you, I think is critically important. So John, I'll stay with you, and now let's, we've talked a little bit about technologies, so far, but maybe we can dive a little bit deeper in some aspects here. Again, overall, there's a lot around visibility that doesn't involve technology, like we talked about defining the business objectives and maybe defining the metrics and so forth. But obviously, technology ultimately is a key enabler to helping to execute this. Can you and one of the things you hear a lot these days around control tower visibility is certainly a buzzword today. So, I mean, what capabilities or functionalities should companies look for around this area?
You have my mind racing again with some of the things that you mentioned in the conversation just now, and so control tower is a good starting point. And I think of and I back up and I think about this context that, freight transportation. If you think about, think you can see the progress of the world in terms of the evolution of freight transportation, the progress of mankind. So when you think about what has happened about the movement of goods that people need in the past, that happened with caravans, that happened with horse and wagon trains, and then with ships and manifested bills of lading, and as society changed and as population clusters grew denser and so on, with the advent of nationwide mail carriers, we had catalog merchants come along and in some cases replace the role of a community or general store. And then Sam Walton, as we got a national network of highways, Sam Walton came along and displaced the catalog merchants by making lots of product easily accessible on the national network. And now Amazon is disrupting the retail business with their ability to get things to customers easily. So I do think that the only reason I bring that up is that it's one thing, we can print up brochures and we can put all sorts of buzzwords in there and the things that are useful and meaningful. But if we don't recognize the context of the world that we live in right now, it's easy to chase features rather than important functions. That being said, I think control tower is table stakes. I think that control tower, multi-mode, SaaS technology, and ease of integration, those are gotta-haves. There's no compromise on that. And if I don't have these core components and I'm a growing concern, it's not a matter of whether I need these things, but when. And I think and I have more thoughts on it, and I don't want to monopolize the whole conversation, but I think those are key components. My management system cannot merely be a database. My management system actually has to provide management and automation.
Yeah, no, I think you hit. I think that's a great point in terms of, number one is the ability. I mean, I'm gonna try to kind of unpack some of the things you said there. One is, I thought it was an interesting kind of evolution there of kind of the particularly the retail industry, and how you and I as consumers buy things. But the fact is that continues to evolve and change. And obviously, one of the big things that's happened with e-commerce has been the growing role of parcel, right? And how parcels become a much more important mode of transportation for virtually all companies today, where, 10, 15 years ago, a lot of companies, parcel was, non-existent, or just something that they used to, in the mailroom, to ship out letters and stuff and packages to just a small number of companies. But we see kind of that growing role in dominance today. So you need a system that obviously, like we talked earlier, is able to adapt to the different modes and adapt to different business constraints and realities and business processes as they come up, because they're going to change, over time. I think what you brought up in terms of, being able to automate those areas. I mean, I still see a lot of companies that are working with, spreadsheets and fax machines. There's still a lot of paper-based, transactions taking place out there. And I think a lot of companies were able to get away with it, if you will, up until now. But I think it's becoming clear that, moving forward, companies are going to have a more difficult time getting away with paper-based processes. So, the ability to automate those areas where, maybe you're just throwing people at the problem right now. And these technologies are mature enough and table stakes, to your point, that, they're proven, they've got a great history and ROI around them. And then I think you also have, some of those emerging capabilities, things like machine learning and AI, Internet of Things, other ways to bring data into systems that are still emerging, and you're seeing some early use cases there. But I think those things are going to become, important as well. Brian, anything to add? Your thoughts on kind of on the technology side of things?
Well, I think you guys did a great job covering it. I agree that if you don't have control tower visibility to all of the different systems within your supply chain, whether you need shipment visibility, price visibility, inventory planning, warehouse, partner connectivity, then you're way behind the eight ball. And then, the only last capability I'd really add is all of this data needs to be, and we've already touched on it several times in this conversation, it needs to be actionable. You need to be able to drive insight from it. And, that control tower, that really has to have that capability in order to, and the analytics behind it to drive that insight for you and for the organization to really give you the value that you need.
Right. And I think related to control tower, I mean, I think, a couple of things there. One is, and I think you both kind of hit upon this in your comments, is that, it really is, when you think about supply chain, when you think about logistics, it truly is a system, right? So transportation doesn't operate in a silo. Warehousing doesn't operate in a silo. Inventory management doesn't operate in a silo. So, really is bringing that unified visibility and understanding how all those pieces work together as part of the system. I think that's a key component or objective of this control tower, view. And I think, secondly, the other aspect of control tower is that, a lot of times it's got to be actionable. Like you said, the information that ultimately gets presented is something that you have to, that's going to make sense for the user. And it's something that, they can quickly recognize what's happening, get some insights, and then ultimately take some action that's ultimately what's going to drive, the business value there. So John, you kind of moving on, we're getting short on time here. So I'm just going to get just a couple of more questions here. Why don't we talk a little bit about, some examples of how, with some of the companies that you've worked with, perhaps, of how closing the gaps in supply chain visibility delivers, business value.
Sure. So I have a couple of quick examples that come to mind to me on this front, and it's again the benefit of having a single comprehensive multi-mode system. So we have a customer that started with us more than a decade ago, and when they came to us, they had $15 million worth of freight spend. Most of it was distributed throughout North America, but that just happened to be their business. The important thing here is that their parcel and their LTL and truckload were completely distinct from one another. So like a lot of shippers, they relied on kind of paper and rule of thumb routing guides. The net of this is the nature of their freight. Their shipments would run anywhere from a couple of pounds to several hundred pounds. So that when they implemented the system, initially, they didn't do shipment and route optimization. They got the benefit of rate optimization. So getting the right carrier in the right lane at the right mode, whether I'm doing a zone 2 move or a zone 3 move or a zone 8 move. Their freight spend immediately went from $15 million annually to $12 million. And then once they implemented the shipment and route optimization along with the rate optimization, their freight spend went from 15 to 12 million to $7 million annually, shipping the same product in the same lanes to the same customers at the same weights, but using the right mode of transportation to accomplish their task. On the other hand, I think about, and that's kind of an outbound scenario, we also have a customer that recently, they're very efficient in what they do in the way of outbound. They combine fleet and they provide common carriers and they do some good things, but they never gave a lot of thought to their inbound. They didn't think that there was a lot of opportunity in inbound. And they looked at their inbound operations and they set out with a goal to save $250,000, approximately a little bit less than $250,000. And as they optimized their inbound freight, they wound up saving more than $1 million. And again, bringing the same product into the same warehouses and the same stores, doing the exact same thing, but using a management system in the way that it should be leveraged in order to let the system do the heavy lifting and give themselves a bottom line advantage, and they can pass that on to their customers and to their shareholders for their benefit without changing anything in the way that they produce and acquire their product.
No, great examples there. And I think, I think you hit upon a few things there that I just want to elaborate on a little bit. One is, a lot of companies still manage their transportation in silos, right? So inbound separate from outbound, maybe parcel separate from, the private fleet separate from common carrier. I think one of the things about visibility, and particularly in the context of a TMS, is the ability to take a more integrated, holistic view of your transportation operations that can then identify those opportunities where you can optimize, inbound and outbound and across modes and across geographies, perhaps, where it makes sense, in a much more integrated fashion. And that's where a lot of this value comes through, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's it. We're singing the same from the same songbook.
Great, great. Brian, any examples from your end?
Sure, I've got one. I mean, John's was a great example of how you can take a complex transportation setup and utilization of multiple modes to really optimize. Mine's more specific around really getting process efficiencies from a network and a system that's been in place for quite some time. We had a large 3PL that was using predominantly EDI for their tracking, but they wanted to be more real time with their status updates. They had a few failures that they didn't receive in time to be able to manage the disruption to their customers, to the supply chain. So they engaged us to start getting their status updates automated via API. And they realized about 20% time savings, not just from the real-time API connectivity, but also because it was employed in a way that was intelligent, that basically brought exceptions, to the surface quickly so that they could counter those disruptions before they really impacted the customer and make some adjustments on the fly. And now that customers working on automating their dispatch through APIs, and expects to reduce labor hours on those activities by 20%. They did experience about 20% time savings on the tracking API system through the automation, through the intelligence and exception handling improvements.
Yeah, another great example. I think, a lot of times when we think about transportation, we sometimes think about, the reduction in rates, right? And fuel surcharges and all that. But there's the time component and the labor component. There's a lot of savings to be had in those fronts, as well. So I think that's another, good example there. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Adrian, but you think about, the time savings, and it's not just saving time. It's about how could those resources be redeployed towards more revenue and value generating activities. Could they be, obviously there's the customer satisfaction improvement that you get from managing those disruptions before they become disruptions, but also increase sales and other efforts that can really drive the revenue. You're a solutions provider now instead of just a track and tracer for a customer.
Absolutely. Great point there. Well, Brian, I'm going to stick with you here for the last question, and then John, you can provide your perspective as well. As a way to wrap up, I mean, what questions should supply chain logistics executives then, ask themselves to assess whether they have the right capabilities in place to close those gaps in their supply chain visibility?
Well, I think it's important first to note that supply chain visibility solutions are available today. They're already out there. They're on the market. There are providers out there. So it's important to take that first step and start receiving some value from that. First, I'd ask, are you leveraging APIs and web capabilities to achieve real-time information? Make sure you've got a clear understanding of the business benefits that you'll obtain through this improved visibility, and make sure you choose your partners carefully. The partners that you choose, they've got complete unfettered access to your very private, confidential business information and data. And you want to make sure that they're, number one, a credible provider, they're financially stable, and have strong data security safeguards, but also, make sure that they treat your data as your property and not as their product. So make sure they have your best interest at heart. And there are many providers out there that can help you achieve your goals and give you long-term satisfaction with your supply chain visibility solution.
Great. John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with the things that Brian shared with us, and consistent with what he shared. I think about if I'm looking for a solution, then I do want to find a solution that I can grow and scale with. So we like to look at our solution as the last TMS that you'll ever have to buy. Regardless of if I put any type of enterprise system in place, there's risk and expense involved in that. I don't want to do that every so many years. So I want to select a provider that has experience, expertise, financial strength, the ability to scale. I don't want to do this over and over again. And not boasting about what we do, but we don't have customers come to us and say, we've outgrown your solution, we have to find something bigger. We already had that solution for them. And that's, I think that's, we see value in looking for a solution like that.
Great, great. So, flexibility, the agility, to really adapt to whatever market conditions, lie ahead. I think going back to the visibility point and some of the things we talked about in Control Tower, I think it's important to note that a lot of times with Control Tower visibility, it's also not just visibility to the shipment or the truck, but it's also having that nested visibility as well, right? Because you want to be able to then connect, drill down from a shipment to an order to the SKUs that are, in that area. So the more granular you can get, that's going to help, customers, ultimately, be able to make more, value-added decisions that are going to drive their, ultimate value. Well, John and Brian, like I always say at the end of all our episodes, we always just manage to scratch the surface on these topics, but we certainly covered a lot of ground today. Both of you provided some great perspectives and insights on this topic. So I want to thank both of you for, making the time to be with us today. John and Brian, thank you.
Thank you. This is very enjoyable. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having us.
I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the MercuryGate website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for John or Brian, you can post it there, and I'm sure they'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you all for watching, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.